we're kind of focusing on three main concepts here. First is guilt, second is shame, and then third is stigma. Guilt is a reflection on behavior. Guilt is I did something bad, or I did something wrong, or I acted or behaved in ways that are outside of my values or how I want to act. The thing about guilt is that it actually no one likes to feel guilt. It's not a pleasant feeling emotion, but it actually spurs us to action, right? Like that feeling of guilt is what makes you go, oh, I gotta address this. I gotta take accountability for this. Or even if your response to it is, I should never do this again, right? Like it might be as subtle as that, but it's a thing that makes you act into not wanting to have that feeling again, right? And if you're sitting there thinking like, experiencing like chronic guilt, like that's something a little different, right? That's not really what we're talking about here. But the, sense of I acted in a way that was outside of my values, I feel crummy about that, and I should probably do something about that or not do that thing again. Shame is I am bad. It is a reflection on self. And it is not action-based, because when you're stuck in shame, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing. If you believe you're not worthy of love and belonging, and you're not worthy of the care of the collective, then there's no there, right? So that is a very big distinction between I did something bad, action. I can change my behavior, and I am bad. Because you can't fundamentally change who you are. So if your self-belief is I am bad, there's no way to go from that. Stigma is the additional layer of being ostracized, isolated, marginalized in some way because of some identity, usually. And so it is the additional level of harm, isolation, policing, social policing of our, the way we move through the world, that happens as a result of a wide variety of identities. In this case, we're talking about the identity of somebody who's been in the commercial sex trades or been trafficked or is involved in prostitution. Prostitution is deeply, deeply stigmatized, just socially speaking, right? So when young people take on that level of stigma, especially as youth, it is intensely impactful. But I wanted to start with a story from really early in my practice, when I was still working in residential programs with young people who had experienced trafficking. And there was a young person in our program who had, at the time, had been there for 9 months. She had been through various kinds of therapy and restorative healing activities, and generally was doing really well, and was interested in getting employment, as many youth we work with are, and was pursuing one of our employment training programs. And so leading up to this, she had done some other internship stuff. She was just ready to do this from our assessment. So the night before she's to go to the interview, she's out shopping with some staff to get an outfit to wear to the interview. And the staff overhears her start to cry in the dressing room, and she kind of gets real emotional, and is able to talk through it a little later. And she said, I looked at myself in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself, because I never thought I'd ever go shopping for anything other than hoe clothes. That's her actual phrasing. And the staff processed through that with her, kind of let us know in the notes that had been going on. And so the next day, the day of the interview, she wakes up and she is just really escalated. She's angry. She's refusing to go to the interview. She doesn't want to have just all these reasons why she doesn't want to go. And so we started to try to process with her and say, what's going on? And she had all these like, I don't have a resume, but she did have a resume, and I all these things. And the staff, again, we'd worked with her a long time. We had a good relationship with her, and that's what makes these moments pivotal. Like, what's really going on? And she said very quietly, just the first time she'd been quiet all morning, she just said, they're gonna know. They're gonna know. And when they find out, no one's gonna want me touching their food. Because this was an employment program at learning how to be a barista and working in a cafe. And so her deepest fear at that point, the thing that made her just unwilling to do this, was about shame, and it was about stigma. right? That dual side of I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of this, and they're going to find out. People are going to know. People are going to like somehow see this in me, that I've had these experiences, and they're going to be disgusted by me. That's the emotion of no one's going to want me touching their food. And so it was a very pivotal moment for me. It's like, of all the things, because this could have been through a lot of trauma, and to walk away after all of that time and to still think so little of herself that she thought she would be found out and no one would want them touching her food or their food. And it just left an indelible imprint on my understanding of shame and stigma. Shame is defined as deeply painful feelings that you are not worthy of love and belonging. Or I would also add, you're not worthy of the care of the collective, be that your family or community or whomever. That feeling of not having the care and protection of your collective. The reason it's so painful is because we're hardwired for connection. We're very social, we rely on each other. And so just at an evolutionary standpoint, so when folks are, do not feel worthy of that, do not feel like they have that care and protection, it's deeply, deeply traumatic. And it's really easy to re-trigger it because it's really about survival, right? So what's happening when someone's triggered is like, it's a survival response, your threat response, not because people are overreactive, but because we actually need each other to survive. And so when that connection is threatened or severed, it lands for many people, not all people, but it lands for many people as trauma. And one of the things that I've heard from you over the years and in different kinds of narratives is, I don't belong in that world anymore, right? So they feel like they're sort of the prostitution or the trafficking world, and then the quote unquote square world or non-prostitution world. And once you've sort of been in that prostitution and trafficking world, you don't feel like you belong here anymore. That core sense of belonging is really what stigma interrupts, right? It's that like, you don't belong here messaging, which is also, right, lands as trauma. So guilt doesn't feel awesome, but is actually correlated with positive health outcomes and positive mental health conditions, whereas shame is inversely correlated with those things and is correlated with addiction, suicide, violence, depression, right? All of those things. So we don't love how guilt feels, but it tends to spur us to action. Shame is really, really toxic for folks. And stigma is really that kind of outer layer that we all, with our beliefs, attitudes, perceptions, words, and actions, we either contribute to or we interrupt those things that are stigmatized beliefs.
Can you give us some examples of the kinds of things? You've given us one wonderful example, other kinds of things, words in particular, that trigger shame?
Well, definitely when we're, like using the word prostitute to describe somebody's, particularly if they're under the age of 18, I would like to believe most people probably wouldn't do that anymore, but that would be like a big example. But even, we talk, we encourage people to think about person first language, right? Which is somebody experiencing homelessness or a person experiencing addiction, right? Rather than saying that person is an addict, right? Or that person is homeless, or that person, is a sex worker or a prostitute or whatever. So that the reason that can land as shaming is because they're a lot more than that, right? When we use language that sort of synthesizes people down to this thing that's, really negative, particularly like addict or, like gang banger, that might be another kind of term, or, street kid, right? Those things, they are descriptive in some way, but they're really harmful. And that person, whoever that is being used to describe, is way more complicated than that particular identity. And so it feels shaming because it feels like you're just sort of observing the worst or a negative part of them and not the whole complete them. And the other risk that we run with some of that language is they just might not identify with it. Like that might not be, how they perceive their experience. So that like sense of you don't see me, you don't understand me, you don't understand where I've come from, that can also be really deeply shaming for folks.
How about things like body shaming? And I'm actually thinking of a case where the question for me was whether shame can cause a kid to go into that life, where I had a mom who kept telling her little girl she was fat and enrolled her in cheerleading and drill team at the age of 7.
Yeah.
Both trauma and shaming, or can shaming drive somebody into
Oh yeah.
Survival sex or running
yeah.
away, or the kinds of things that
It
we all see?
It definitely in so many ways too, right? So the example of a parent who is, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not fast enough or athletic enough or verbal enough or whatever. Anytime a family runs a "you're not enough" message, that is going to run the high risk. I won't say it always does it, but run a pretty high risk, because people are really just pretty shame resilient, somehow they came out that way. It's not that simple, but maybe outside the scope of this particular video. So for most people, the you're not good enough, whatever that enough is deeply shaming. And if you think about it using the definition we just talked about, part of what is what's unsettling for folks about this and what can be traumatic is we need that care of and protection of the collective. So if the collective, the parent in this case, is saying, in order to get love and care in this family, you need to adhere to a certain body size or a certain kind of gender or certain this, then the underlying message is, oh, if I don't do that, I'm not worthy. And the deeper underlying message is, my worthiness is conditional, right? My worthiness and the love and the care I believe everybody should have as their birthright is conditional on looking a certain way, performing a certain way. I think the other flip side of it is when we try to use shame to be corrective and say, try to police sexuality or interest in people or, types of media or culture that parents might not agree with or whatever. And, we use shame to try to change people's behavior. And the thing about that is, I won't say that shame can't change someone's behavior, because I think that's untrue and disingenuous, but it has a very high price, right? And there's a cost to it. I also don't think it's usually particularly effective. Because you can use something to change something doesn't mean it's a good or most effective way to change that thing. And it leaves a little toxic seed in that person. So all of those things together, my worthiness is unconditional or my worthiness is conditional on, performing or being whatever way you want, or is expected, is, it's really isolating for folks. And that's one of the kind of core features of shame, is that sense of isolation, that you're different than everybody else, that no one else experiences this, that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. When honestly, what's wrong is the kind of hot mess that's around us most of the time.
So is it fair to assume that shame can be magnified depending on how it happens? So for example, there's a difference between a parent saying to a child, you've been selling yourself, you shouldn't be doing that, and a parent and a prosecutor saying in a courtroom, this youth was selling themselves on the street while on the run in front of a grandmother and a parent.
I don't really love either of those situations. Neither of them is going to be a good experience for that young person. I guess what I would think about in these is two different scenarios, is both context and power differential. So, and I don't necessarily know that one is better or worse. I just think that they're a little bit different, right? So, depending on the kind of, care and underlying relationship that parent had with that kid, that conversation could land a bunch of different ways, right? It could land as extremely shaming, and it could land as a well-intentioned parent who maybe doesn't have the best language, but is still inherently communicating care and concern, and not a bunch of shame and judgment, right? It's a lot of it is about the emotional undercurrent of the person doing the communicating, right? that becomes different in a courtroom because you don't have a bunch of you don't have that relationship. You don't have that history. You can't do tough love with a stranger. Like there's no love there, right? You gotta have some relationship in that bucket in order to, be that kind of direct with people. Also in a court, there's systemic power imbalance, right? You've got a person who, oftentimes defendants or victims or witnesses, we got this person talking to a room full of people and they feel like you don't know me, you don't know my life. And so having someone who is essentially a stranger kind of tell some of the most horrifying bits of your story to a room of also strangers, that's its own specific kind of trauma, right? That is I would think about that as like a very significant kind of emotional exposure. Because again, like very personal, painful parts of yourself are just kind of on display. Whereas in a one-on-one conversation with a parent, like it could be shamey and judgy. It could be, well-intended, but maybe not the right language, which is going to feel very different than like having your whole life put on, what you feel like is under a microscope in front of strangers.
Or in front of your own relatives.
Or in front of your own relatives. Yeah, that's right. You had asked if your grandmother was in the audience. Right. Yeah. I mean, honestly, that's probably the worst kind of situation because you have the vulnerability of like all of these strangers and the vulnerability of, and people that I'm going to sit around the holiday table with for the rest of my life.
Right. Can you give us some examples of what shame looks like when it's acted out? You've talked a little about that one example, but are there others, and where does it come from?
Right. Well, it can manifest in so many ways, right? So at the sort of basic level, it can manifest in a just straight up trauma response, right? And we tend to categorize those as, really when your amygdala or your survival brain, the part that regulates fight, flight, freeze, and I also add to appease and disassociate, right? Most people heard of fight or flight or fight, flight, and freeze. So this isn't, this is an actual neurophysiological function that is happening, right? Where you perceive a threat. Doesn't matter if it's real or not. If your brain's doing its very wise job of scanning the world for threats, and you perceive a threat, well, shame is perceived as a threat, right? Because of that inherent need to have the care and protection of the collective. So it can cause a trauma response, right? So fighting, fleeing, freezing, dissociating is like checking out mentally or psychologically or cognitively from the situation around you. And this is sort of my layperson definition here. And separating yourself from your awareness in order to endure what's happening. And then fawning or appeasing, right? Where you're sort of kind of allying yourself with the threat or the perpetrator or the source of harm as a means to survival. So it can trigger just your straight up survival responses. It also can lead to a range of what we would maybe call, like avoidant behaviors or reactive behaviors, right? So if I know that if I go home and my parent is in a mood and they're going to get real shamey or judgy on me about that thing because maybe they're having a bad day, maybe I'm just going to avoid being home. Or if I know things are going to be rough, maybe I walk in the door and I pick a fight because at least then I'm controlling, the energy flow by creating the chaos to get wrapped up in. So it can have a very broad range, but I would say most people are pretty avoidant of things that they know are going to cause shame. And then once they get into a shame spiral, that tends to be some of that amygdala survival brain action, right? Where you're really in a survival response and you need to ground and get yourself back to some sort of grounded awareness before you're going to be able to have real kind of logical conversations.
And the disassociation piece.
What say more about that?
How does that? I remember at a training you saying a social worker, a caretaker should never touch somebody who's dissociation?
Yeah, yes, for sure. So when people have kind of psychologically checked out, also someone in a freeze response, right? When someone's in a freeze response, they're usually hyper aware of what's going on around them. They're just frozen, like they can't speak, or speech is hard, they can't move, or movement is difficult. But they tend to be like aware of what's going on, just kind of immobilized. Dissociation is you're not really aware, you're just sort of really checked out. I would say across all of these, a really important rule is don't get in people's personal space unless they move towards for comfort. And honestly, in a lot of your settings, that's probably not going to, be relevant or make a lot of sense. But yes, you should never try to move in or touch, or, because sometimes our natural instinct is to want to like put a hand on a shoulder and be like, "Are you okay?" But, really, when someone's having a strong trauma response, using your presence, using your voice, making eye contact, if that route really, rather than kind of getting in someone's physical space. The other thing I would add is when folks are having a stress or trauma response, those of us not having that trauma response usually want to talk to them, right? We want to use our words because that's what we do. We're like, "Are you okay? Do you need any blah, 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 blah," right? Honestly, if someone really is having a trauma response, they need to get back into some grounded awareness, back into their body, to take a few deep breaths, wide range of things people do before we do the talkie. And part of it just is the how your brain works. So when you're having a survival response, your thinking brain, your executive functioning brain, the one that thinks about consequences and taking other people's perspective and your plan for tomorrow, that part of your brain is offline. So you actually can't have a conversation with someone where it requires perspective taking or future thinking or those sorts of what we call like higher order or executive functioning thinking until that part of the brain is back online, right? So we need a good amount of noticing when people are stressed out, being able to help them regulate, get back in their body, get their frontal brain back online, and then we can talk about all the other bigger picture stuff we want to talk about. But if you try to do that when someone's freaking out, you're likely to just make whatever that response is take longer, get bigger, just it's not the way to get out of it. It's the,
I asked that question because I had a case in juvenile court with a young person who had stolen a small package of something from a grocery store, and security walked out and to stop her, and she put the package down and said, "Here, take it, don't touch me." Mm-hmm. And of course security touched her, and she went ballistic, punching and screaming, and ended up with a felony robbery charge because of her response. She didn't remember anything that happened after she got out of the store. And it turned out, I learned later during the course of this case, that she'd been gang raped. Mm-hmm. So that's the dissociation response. And I don't think we see that very often, but we really need to understand it as judges and social workers, and it makes an impression on you when you see it and hear about it. What about things, just well, before I go on to language, are there things that kids go through to stages that they go through?
Like stages of change?
Like stages of change. You knew where I was going.
I did. So I'm just gonna be transparent about this. I'm a real big proponent of stages of change, behavior change theory. This is a theory, it's a trans theoretical model kind of emerging in the mid-late 90s, initially around substance use. Now is more kind of broadly understood to be a kind of a model of behavior change. The thing that I think is so helpful about it is that it really applies to all behavior change. So people can be one person in front of you can be in a different stage around, leaving a trafficking situation or leaving a toxic partner, and then a different stage around, going back to school or getting education, and they might be in a different stage around this. So it is extremely helpful for service providers, first responders, whoever's working with folks, to be able to identify just kind of in a quick assessment based on how somebody is talking about a topic, what stage they're in, and then adjust their expectations of what's going to happen next and how they intervene, right? So I won't talk you through all of them because that would also be its own thing. But when somebody, the first stage is called pre-contemplation. There's some fancy language and stages of change. I try to kind of translate it. I call these a brick wall conversation, right? So this is, I'm not going to change. You can't make me change. Change is impossible. I don't want to change. It is you. I've done this long enough to know you're out there listening. You're like, oh, I've had a brick wall conversation, right? So that person is not ready to think about that change. Like that is what they have communicated to you in that conversation. It doesn't mean that they're not capable of change. It doesn't mean that they won't change at some point. It means at that moment, they're not thinking about changing. So our job as service providers or whatever your role is to, acknowledge that somehow being a brick wall is serving them in some way, right? This is the little mantra I use. And it is, all of those behaviors are serving a purpose, right? And that kind of gets to my bigger philosophy on sort of strengths-based approach and trauma work. But people do things for a reason, and until they have a behavior to replace another behavior, they're going to keep doing that behavior. So planting seeds, acknowledging, and then moving on, because I've rarely met a person where there isn't something about their life that they're willing to talk about. So if you hit that brick wall, plant seeds, offer, if anything ever changes, if you ever want to do something different, whatever, we're here and we can support you. But and this is again not in sequence, but if a young person hits the action stage, right, and they're really they're showing up and they're like, I want support and help, and I'm ready to do this. One of the mistakes we make here is that maybe that kid has been really disengaged for a while, and we've sort of given up, and we're like, well, they're not going to change, and we've heard this before. And so we miss the opportunity, right? One of the things that happens in stages of change is you go from very low motivation to change the thing to very high motivation. And so we're constantly needing to gauge, what's their motivation here to do this? And how do we increase their motivation, change their understanding of what's possible? What else is, kind of change, seeing different messages in the environment is one of the things that the theory talks about. And some of that happens just through conversations with us. Some of that happens through other services that they're in, but we will be more effective in a shorter period of time and do a lot less banging our own heads against the wall if we simply accept that when someone is in a brick wall place, we're not going to be able to lecture them into changing their mind. Like that, you might be able to plant some seeds that they chew on and think about, and something happens later. That happens. But you're not going to lecture somebody who's in this particular stage into just a complete epiphany, right? That's just not how humans operate. We're just way too slow processing for that. One of the other things that's real important in stages of changes is addressing and resolving ambivalence. Ambivalence is being stuck between, two or more options. And so a lot of, I think, what courts see and what service providers see is they're wishy-washy and they're ambivalent, and that's the process. So getting some tools so that you can both recognize ambivalence, you understand what it is, and you can really do supportive interventions that go, okay, we see that you're ambivalent. We're not going to punish you for being ambivalent. We're going to accept that you're ambivalent and figure out how to identify and resolve this. Again, always sort of functioning or focusing on what's their underlying intrinsic internal motivation. The thing that courts can do is they can leverage a particular kind of external motivation, right? If you do not do this, then this will happen. And, we have a powerful system that can impose that and make sure that happens. That's external motivation. It is a tool, right? It works, but it's not the same thing as internal motivation, right? Internal motivation is the thing that has staying power. And so I think that always understanding the balance of internal and external motivation and trying to kind of use external motivation thoughtfully, judiciously where we can, but always like, what matters to this person? What do they care about? And then trying our best to kind of center around whatever the answer to that question is for this person.
I was interested in the ambivalence stage because I'm wondering whether shame fits in there. Can it be sort of, well, I'm really ashamed of this and I want to change, but I don't.
Sure. Yeah.
Can that be
part
of the conversation? I mean, not the conversation, but what's going on in that person's head?
Oh yeah. There's so many places where that ambivalence is just like, gosh, it's so intense for people and really confusing, right? I'll give a kind of a, I try to not always use extreme examples, although they do make a point. So we work with a number of young people who have come out of intergenerational family trafficking, and where the parents' generation, the grandparents' generation were in prostitution, sex trades in some ways, and it was just sort of like that was just part of the family business, economic strategy, whatever. There's almost always a lot of trauma in those situations, and it's deep and it's layered and it's historical and it's, and it's complicated. One of the most difficult things about working with those particular youth is almost, I don't want to say universally, but the vast majority of them have this intense ambivalence between really wanting to do something different with their lives and feeling like they're completely abandoning, or that that if they get out of the life, that would be a judgment on their family. The other thing that happens is often this happens with addiction, when there's a lot of addiction in families too, where, families start saying like, who do you think you are? Oh, you think you're better than us? You think you can get out of this? Oh, go ahead, try to break the cycle. Like this real stories I've had. And so when there's a lot of like toxicity in a family system like that, there's just, layers and layers and layers of shame that person has to get through. It's not just what do I want for myself, it's actually like, how do I honor the love and care I have for my family while acknowledging that that's been a really toxic experience, environment, upbringing, or whatever. So that ambivalence is it's really deep. Like I've had clients who just like had to say, in order to get well, I had to just accept the fact that I was never going to have a relationship with certain family members that just weren't toxic. And so, that's some deep experiences of ambivalence. I think other ambivalence, like, a lot of young people's trafficking experiences are intersected with their their peers. And so, they're ambivalent, like, what's happening here is messed up and harmful and I don't like it, but like, these are my friends and these are my people. And like, you see a lot of ambivalence there. You see a lot of ambivalence around substance use and recovery. And one of the real simple ways I would say that is like, when you get sober, you have to figure out new ways to cope. And you often have to find a new social network. Not all drug use is tied to social connections, but a lot of it is. So like the ambivalence there is, it's going to suck. It's going to be painful. Like all my people that I've relied on, like I'm not going to be able to rely on anymore. I'm going to have to make new connections. So there's a lot of ambivalence in there too. And the normal, like I have more than one option and I don't know what to choose, but the real deep stuff is, it's gonna be really painful to make this choice and either, kind of acknowledging what's going on in the family or acknowledging your coping strategies or whatever. And that's why it takes a long time. People are in that stage usually for a long time. Ambivalence doesn't, it's not a conversation or a, exercise you do or a therapy session. You grind on it for a while. And then usually, this is the next stage, you kind of make some you make some initial attempts. And so sometimes we see that too, where, the person has, made a decision and they're trying, but like there's still internal or external barriers. They can't, they tried, but the craving was too hard, or they tried, but people still found them on the bus route, or, they wanted to do this kind of job, but I really just, I don't actually have the capacity to do that kind of job right now. So that's called the preparation stage. And what happens there is people are trying, like they're testing it out and they're seeing how it works, but they're not quite ready to like make the change. So it's real easy to get caught up in like, well, they don't care, or they're not trying hard enough, or we're trying harder than the client is. And I think stages of change that allows us a framework to just put all that in the trash bin, because it's not true anyway, and go, okay, I see that you have tried 3 times to show up for treatment and you've not made it, and you come here and you report that you want to go and you're still not, getting there. Like, that's not that they don't care, and it's not that they're not taking things seriously. It's that they do not have either the tolerance, the skills, the access, or the resources to do whatever that thing is. And that makes our job then to figure out how to help build their tolerance, build their skills, increase their access and resources to be able to do the thing.
And that was so brought home to me when I was preparing for this yesterday, and I was going through my notes from some of my court cases from many years ago. I took a lot of notes about the CSEC kids and kids with mental health issues, and going through those notes, every single case was full of shame and sometimes stigma. But the shame, getting kicked out of your house, being cycled to grandpa's ex-girlfriend in one state, and then another ex-girlfriend in another state, and then an aunt in California, going to 13 schools. How does a child even deal with that kind of shame and stigma of not being wanted anywhere? The case I told you about, the statements in front of mom and grandma, the teenager whose mom called her pimp to pick her up when she fell and hurt herself, and so mom wouldn't have to go get her. How do you even how do you cope with that kind of how do you ever get to stages of change from there? It was, I was just stunned going back through all these notes about all of the shame, and it makes you think as a judge, as it did then, about how your language affects what they feel. And I know you, social workers, service providers, probation counselors, we all do the same thing in our different roles. So what about the language that we use? How do we make it so that kids feel less shame, less stigma?
Well, I mean, that's a very broad question.
It is.
Yeah, so I think that there's some kind of low-hanging fruit that is pretty, generally accepted idea. I mentioned one of them earlier about really trying to use person-first language. Like that's an example. I also, and I know this is can be a touchy subject for folks. I really strive to use gender neutral language as well. I try really hard to not just default to using a female gender pronoun to talk about victims, or a male gender pronoun to talk about perpetrators. There are so many male, trans, and non-binary youth out there who've experienced exploitation, trafficking, harm, trauma, and assault that don't even think that that's what happened, because they don't think that can happen to people in that their body, or their sex or their gender. So those things are hugely important. And then I get into, areas that are maybe a little squidgier, like really striving to have non-judgmental kind of victim-centered language. And by that, I would mean, oftentimes I've done a fair amount of court advocacy and juvenile court, and, the youth is not often the center of the conversation. they're not like what the prosecutor's point they're trying to make is, and the defense attorney's point of what they're trying, they're sort of like with all due respect, sort of like a cast of characters in a court. And I think often young people get really kind of lost and swept up in that. And not that you can always like ask how every young person wants a proceeding to go. And there's lots of things in a proceeding that are just, technically going to be outside of their control. But, how can you, find one or two small ways in an interaction, in a proceeding, wherever, to really try to, I like talk about things in buckets, like to put a little dignity in their dignity bucket, to really like say something thoughtful and personal to the client, the young person as a person, right? Like have a human moment with them, because you're about to preside or share stories with, probably a room full of strangers, or, strangers and their loved ones, about deeply personal, painful things. And so how can you, use your language and use whatever your position is to, kind of just front load or soften a little bit of that with something that is really kind of promoting their dignity. Anywhere you have the ability to offer some choice, I think that is hugely important. These are young people that have like systematically and chronically had their power taken away and their agency taken away and their bodily autonomy taken away. So places where you have choice to offer, I really think that's an important one. And then again, if you think about what I said earlier about guilt is a reflection on behavior, shame is a reflection on self, listen for that in your language, right? Do you say, oh, so-and-so is such a, fill in the blank, or so-and-so is really acting like a fill in the blank, right? There's subtle differences, but they're really significantly different, right? Like they don't sound different, but if you kind of train yourself to really focus on, people are way more than the sum of their worst moments. If people need to be held accountable, then some measure of guilt and accountability makes sense. But if you are, ever using language that is really shame and you're worthless, you're not going to amount to anything. If, I can imagine maybe someone saying, if you keep down this path, you're not going to amount to anything, right? Like anything in that space, I wouldn't recommend avoiding. That's going to be real shamey.
There are a lot of ways that judges can make youth feel, but both give them some choice in even little ways and also be strength-based, play to their strengths. I asked every youth who appeared in front of me how they'd like me to address them. Crazy. And they would look at me and say, "You're the judge." And I would say, "But you're the person I'm addressing. So what would you like me to call you?" And, it was sort of that first time in court, it really, it gives them a different perspective, I think, at least in some cases. The other thing I always did was ask youth what they like to do. And 9 times out of 10, it was play basketball or, dance or do music. But I would ask them if they liked to write or sing or draw or whatever. And I also told them that if they'd like to do whatever their passion was and bring it to court, I would be happy to have it in the courtroom. Not an order, don't have to do it if you don't want to, only if you want to. We had a program in our juvenile court where kids wrote poetry with us, in a guided program. They published books every year and they're absolutely wonderful. I had a number of youth bring their poems to court and give them to me, and they were incredible. I had another person give me a 42-page novel, which was clearly autobiographical, although fictional characters. And I had a courtroom full of art that I framed because they brought it to me. And it was it was sort of amazing that they responded that way. I had one young man come to court and rap in court on the record. It was absolutely wonderful. He had the whole courtroom, practically dancing. But there are a lot of ways to make youth feel valued even when they are in court, and to give them some agency, even if it's just by asking them how they want to be addressed. But there are also so many ways, I think you've talked about this in some of your trainings, that they can misinterpret before they get to those stages of change. The questions or you're asking, or the things you're saying. I'd like you to take a UA, or I'd like you to have a mental health assessment, or what does a kid hear when you say, I would like you to have a mental health assessment?
You want the honest answer to that, with including the microaggression? They think this judge thinks I'm crazy. That's what they think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And
that lands poorly for most people. Just that belief, right? I'd say, I would say amongst the younger generation, there is actually I have seen an uptick in mental health awareness and like a decrease in mental health stigma, but I don't think that's still most of the kids coming into juvenile court, right? I still think you want me to talk to a quote unquote shrink, that means you think I am quote unquote crazy. And I do understand that's a kind of a mental health microaggression, but like that is the thing that they would say. So I am being candid because that is really how they frame it.
So there are ways of phrasing that. I think you can correct me on this. Have you ever thought about getting help, talking to somebody else, that kind of thing? And their reaction generally, in my court at least, was, I'm not talking to anybody about my stuff. And the question I would ask in response to that was, so this was particularly when it came to drug use, but it was also all sorts of counseling. So which do you think takes more strength, to talk to somebody or just to bury it and barrel through it?
It's a great question. I got through to some kids, didn't it?
It did get through.
I said it did.
It did get through to some kids. And so I think that there are ways of thinking through how you deal with the shame and the stigma and all the stuff that these, incredibly traumatized kids have gone through. How to get them to go along without further traumatizing them, further stigmatizing them, further shaming them.
Yeah. And I think that you gave so many great examples. I sort of referenced the idea of shame resilience earlier, and your strategies really are in that camp. Like it's the, how do I center your dignity? Asking how people want to be addressed. It's like a basic common decency kind of, or common humanity kind of thing. And it's a little nugget of agency, right? It's a little nugget of like, I have some amount of at least how I'm going to be addressed in this court. I also think the other thing that really kind of flagged to shame resilience from it was the art and the like invitation to multiple creative ways of processing. I think that this is important for a number of reasons. One, it's just a healing strategy. Artistic expression is just, creativity is just healing, right? Like there's just that. The other thing is developmental. Like we're the adults in this, loosely speaking, we're the adults in this situation. So we're using adult brains, mostly speaking, but young people are not. Like they're, by definition, they don't have adult brains yet, and they're just not as primed or developed to have the same kinds of verbal one-on-one kinds of conversations that become very normal in adulthood. There's the discomfort with talking to adults. They might not have the words yet. They may still really think more in symbol and metaphor. They haven't, kind of matured to that point. So giving them multiple pathways for expression healing, giving them some amount of agency and power in the courtroom that's really kind of centered on their dignity. Those are really great shame resiliency practices. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It was amazing to me with the writing and the poetry that these kids could say things they could never say to a therapist or never
Right.
would say to a therapist. They would expose themselves utterly in poetry, but not to
Right.
another human being in words.
Yeah, it's so true. And again, I think some of it's developmental. I think some of it's your personal temperament. I think some of it's cultural. And in lots of different ways, both around, kind of race, ethnicity, national origin, but also around gender, where, there's just a different thing that creative process does for our ability to get words, thoughts, and feelings out. But we're really focused on like direct talking, both in our court system, but also in our mental health system. I've been in practice for, lots of years. And when I was in direct practice, I will say hands down, I think the most transformative moments that I witnessed were with youth in doing creative practices, often in groups. And that's really where you could just see transformation happen.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. I believe we are out of time, but this has been very informative. Leslie,
Thanks, Judge Matt.
Is an amazing trainer in all venues, and I'm grateful for the training she's given us in King County and throughout Washington. And thank you all for being part of this.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
I don't think it's a matter of debriefing, particularly if you're in the courtroom. I think it's a matter of preventing it in the first place, and if it starts, shutting it down. When I had a prosecutor who started to talk about a child having sold themselves on the street, I just stopped it. I said, "You're not using that language in my courtroom." The language actually was prostituting themselves, not using gender neutral language. And I just shut it off. And I do think also there are other kinds of, we talk about these youth as victims. Frequently we and law enforcement talk about rescuing them. That is not how they see themselves. It sort of plays into the shaming issue, I believe, and Leslie can correct me if she thinks I'm wrong about this. I had a mom who kept talking about her child being a victim in court, and I just said, she may have been a victim in the past, but whether or not she's a victim now and in the future is completely up to her. And I just think that you have to make sure that nobody has the ability or the right to shame these kids in your courtroom. And that's our job. Part of our job as judges. Leslie?
Yeah, thanks, Judge Mack. Of course, I love the answer about prevention or sort of interrupting it as soon as you see it. I think if in the moment the proceeding either needs to go on or, I think it's always fine to pause, acknowledge that a moment has happened, and move on as we need to. I think in general, that is a skill that we all should get a little better at. I think we would have more courageous and useful conversations if we could do that. Because what usually happens is something is said, and to the kind of point about what kind of can happen in the brain too, if we don't, and I saw another question in here about how do we create kind of some space and time in the courtroom. So sorry, I'm just going to thread that right in here, because I think it's a great question. And I would just start with pausing and asking everybody to just take a breath. Like, you have all the power to do that. Wow, that was a tough moment. I'm I'm just going to take a beat. I'm going to take a pause. Right. And then just do it. Like, just let it, settle that, and it sometimes it only just takes a few moments for that person then to just, be able to kind of catch up and like catch their breath and, move on with the thing. It also, I think, when done with the right quality of presence, is a way of acknowledging that a harmful, hurtful thing happened, but not like derailing the whole conversation, because that's actually also not helpful. Like making a thing bigger than it needed to be, also not helpful. Derailing a proceeding, definitely not helpful. But just we don't use language like that in my courtroom. That was a tough thing. And I know that just by the very nature of what you do, we talk about a lot of hard things. So I'm not suggesting that you would do this for every hard moment. Although I do think understanding the emotional response is something that I presume judges clock and anybody who's sort of managing a room of people is paying attention to. But specifically when the person we're talking about has been shamed in some way or really, treated in a way where they're not just had to tell an awful story in front of strangers, because that's part of the nature of what we're doing, right? But where someone has really been unfair to them, right? Where a prosecutor or a parent or someone else has really said something in a way that we know they shouldn't have. There was a different way to say it, and it is a harm that should be addressed. Like those are the moments where I recommend sort of a pause, small acknowledgement, and moving on.
And going back and looking at Leslie's answer to that and some of these other questions, I think all of it points to the need for training of everybody who comes in contact with these youth. If you have multidisciplinary teams, everybody on the team needs to be trained. Probation counselors need to be trained. Your court staff needs to be trained. Social workers in the CPS system, the child welfare system, and probation counselors, they all need to be trained on how their words impact what these youth feel and how to respond to things like disassociation. We can't do this work if we're not surrounded by people who've been trained to work with us and work with these youth. I just think that's critical, and it's made a huge difference here. One of the things we do in King County, we have an advocate system for youth, and anybody can request an advocate for a youth, and I could request an advocate for a youth. And the way I did it, I didn't tell the youth I was appointing a CSEC advocate or requesting. What I did was say, I would like to recommend that you have an advocate. This person is just for you. This person does not report to the court. You don't have to do it. It's completely up to you whether or not you want to engage with this person. That gives some choice to the youth. It also gives the youth a lifeline, because that advocate doesn't report to the court if they're out and they're in trouble, and they know they're not going to get turned in to the police or the court for being out on a warrant or whatever. It's an emergency lifeline in addition to giving them some agency. That's been an extremely successful here. I don't know how many other places do it. There was a question about the poetry and art. I posted Pongo Poetry Project link in both the chat and on the Padlet. It's a wonderful program. They operate in a lot of different places now. I highly recommend it. The art and the music, that just came from the kids. That was not a guided program. I just said, if you want to do it, bring it in. And they did. I mean, there was really quite incredible response. So you have the ability to do that on your own as a judge, working with probation or not, just talking to the youth. So there are ways you have one-on-one conversations with these youth that makes a difference in their lives and gives these kids who have, especially if they're exploited, no control over anything in their lives. You give them just a little bit, it inches them forward a little bit at a time. And I think it makes a difference. Leslie can correct me if I'm wrong.
Nope. I would look for opportunities to do twice as much of it. I mean, I say this, kind of in general training, like if you can think of 3 places in this conversation to offer a choice, can you come up with another 3? That would be the kind of really agency-based approach that I think is helpful.
There's another question here. What if the kid's family do not do their part or do not provide support? That's really tough. And, we now know, because there's a fair amount of research on it, that many youth who are exploited by third parties were trafficked by their families before they were trafficked by anybody else. So in those cases, it could be, as Leslie was describing earlier, intergenerational family business, but it could also be the result of COVID and people losing jobs and family needing to pay rent or buy food. It's gotten worse, and we need to be really aware of that and figure out in our own communities what other resources may be available to help these youth and make sure that everybody we work with, as I said, is trained. I just cannot overemphasize the importance of training on these issues. Leslie, there's another question about, sorry, court process.
I was gonna, sorry, go ahead. I was gonna weigh in a minute on the family thing.
Go ahead,
because I
please do.
think it's, I think this is really one of the poorly understood like areas of trafficking work. And I think that the kinds of home-based settings, kinds of situations where youth are recruited out of, or how their exploitation or trafficking experience starts, has shifted radically in the last 15 years, right? So I want to just sort of acknowledge the long game picture here, which is, things work very differently now in the commercial sex trades than they did 15 years ago. So that all being said, I have always believed and anecdotally trained on what you're now saying is there's actually some evidence for, which is that lots of, maybe not all, I don't even know if it's most, but many, many young people who end up with third-party traffickers had some exposure to trafficking or exploitation in their family of origin, right? Maybe it was like a one-off thing or a thing that happened a couple of times and we don't talk about it. And sometimes, again, prostitution is the family business, but there often was something, and that was just anecdotally stuff that, by the time they ended up in the programs that I was working in or running, the stories that we heard were, I already knew how to do that. Like that had already sort of happened to me by the time I met that person. So we anecdotally knew that to be true. That being said, I have also worked with young people who come from families where they would have done anything to help their child. So how I understand families now in the context of what is happening in the families of children who are being trafficked is that there is a spectrum. I understand most things on a spectrum. There are families who are trafficking their children, like they are the trafficker or they were an early trafficker. I don't think we identify as much of this as happens. I think it's gotten a little bit better with some of the technology, but I also think there's more of it, right? Then there is part of the spectrum where they are, and I think this might have been a little bit what this question was getting to, where they are not trafficking their child, but they either are not present, there are other kind of abuse or neglect issues going on, right? Where they're not helping the situation be better, nor are they really causing it, right? Then there is parents who are really upset that this is happening and really like concerned, but either they do not have the skills, presence, their own mental health. And, I call that there's sort of the difference, but like how engaged, right? So if you're really like, I'm concerned, but I'm disengaged, and then you have parents who are entirely engaged. You have families who would do anything to help this situation with their young person or to find their young person. So I want to be very careful that we never think about families in trafficking cases as being homogeneous, because they're really not. Like they really do range a wide spectrum. So you really want to look at like what resources, and not just financial resources, but like, are they present for the person? Are they like, I staff with a number of different kinds of teams, and there are always a handful of youth where their guardian, caregiver, parent is definitely not trafficking them, but the way they are interacting with that child is for sure the reason the kid is running. It is for sure the reason that the kid is running into dangerous trafficking situations, right? So you really have to kind of assess, what is happening, and then what resources in your area, different areas have different things, can be offered to the family. I'll also put in a plug here for Team Hope at National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They support family. They do broad range and can, provide support to families. So this is an area that's sort of underdeveloped as far as services for trafficking goes. And so I was really glad to see this question.
There is a question about a state where every youth who has a criminal charge gets a mental health evaluation. So it's not a judge saying, I want you to have something, it's just standard for everybody. Is that better or worse?
You want me to answer this one?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think that this is different. And the reason it is different is because it has been normalized across the system. Right? You don't feel stigma when things are normalized, right? Like that's sort of that those are two ends of the equation, right? So if it's just normalized and everybody does it, well, there's no stigma around it, right? And not to say that there's not broader stigma about mental health, but if that kid knows, well, it's not because they think something about me, it's that every kid who goes to court gets that, it's been normalized within the system. So I actually think that probably good just in general to do mental health assessments of kids in juvenile court. So I like that policy. But also it means that it is totally normalized for the youth who, where it really is a significant need, and it was likely to be taken in sort of a negative way. Yeah.
I wanted to go back for a minute to shame and language and how courts can affect things. And I think it's important for us to understand, it takes a while to understand how shame works on the broad scheme of things with youth who are being exploited. But I think it's really important for us to understand that third-party exploiters take advantage of shame. They use it to groom and recruit kids on websites, through body shaming, on gaming websites, in all sorts of circumstances. It used to be at the mall, now it's online. And shame is just an incredibly powerful weapon for people who are trying to take advantage of kids. And many of these cases end up being sextortion cases, or youth end up being trafficked by folks who have groomed them because they have first made them shamed about something. And I think there is certain language about rescuing and being a victim that further marginalizes youth who are already marginalized. And we know these youth frequently come from marginalized communities that are already considered victims. So by calling them victims in this context, or talking about rescuing them from their families or their lives, you're just adding to the shame and the marginalization they already fear and suffer. Leslie, if I'm off base with that, please chime in.
Nope. No, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, it's one of the things that's tricky is that oftentimes our intentions are very good. Like we're really trying to say something that we think is going to be impactful or helpful, but it is just deeply isolating for that person. So kind of having a general understanding, broad training, knowing how to listen for shame language versus guilt language. There was some questions in here about stages of change too, which I don't need to get into deeply, but a lot of that is about managing your own expectations of what is possible in this particular conversation, in this particular proceeding. Right. So I know if this person in front of me is really in brick wall mode, we're not going to have some big transformative moment here today. It's just not how it's going to happen. And so it allows people, right, whomever the person is, to like not get caught up in it. We might want it to go differently. That would be awesome. But like expecting a brick wall to not be a brick wall is a losing proposition. And understanding that this process like takes time. So having some just sort of basic awareness of how people move through these and how people move through stress and trauma responses, which was there's another kind of question about in there, and adjusting, right, your expectation of how this conversation is going to go, how this proceeding is going to go, how whatever to that. And then being able to be flexible and dynamic when you notice those signs of someone getting really like angry or like explosive, or somebody who had been like kind of alert and engaged, all of a sudden someone's on their chair like this, right? Like, I know, so that's often a sign of some sort of dissociation, right? Like that, maybe not always, maybe sometimes it's kind of posturing, but like those would be the moments to just stop. And I know that there's some discretion that folks have about like when you can pause and take a break and all of that, but like you can just pause what's happening in the courtroom for 30 seconds, right? Like I don't think you have to like, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Judge Mack, but like I don't think you have to like take a recess or anything to do that, to just actually slow things down to basically accommodate for people to be able to regulate. As a culture, as a society, we're like really not good at this, right? So it feels a little weird initially, but you can almost immediately sort of see the impacts when you do allow people to have a little bit of space to get there. And it really is like a neurological process, right? Your survival brain, your old wise amygdala that we like evolved with over millions of years, is automatic. If it experiences or perceives a threat, doesn't matter if it's real, but like, for instance, you start talking about, the terrible thing that they experienced, it perceives that threat and it takes this prefrontal cortex offline. It says, we don't need you right now. Our only job is to survive. And so if we're doing all this fancy talking stuff and expecting people to like have a thoughtful response, and then they can't do that, and then we somehow punish them for that, well, that's obviously really not good. But even just seeing that and just going, just need to take a moment. And I think in general, a lot of the courtroom proceedings that at least I was in the court for, people are trying to be compassionate, right? So if somebody's like really emotional or crying, like I have definitely seen judges say, let's take a moment. And I think we need to do a lot more of that a lot earlier, before really like larger emotions are really emerging. Because I mean, I've taught for a long time, like, when that room is having a moment, when things have gotten, right? Like you feel that. And so it's sort of bringing a little bit of like facilitation, trauma-informed facilitation in, would be, I think, where the set of tools might be for doing some of this. The other thing I'll say is, I think animal dogs in courtrooms, therapy critters, they, I think, can be wildly effective, especially for younger folks. Advocates having other people in the, present behind them, making more of an effort to like get people to court with folks so that they feel like they actually like have folks there supporting them. I think all of those, because there've been a couple of questions here about lessening the impacts of trauma and sort of managing some of that in the courtroom. I think those would be some concrete strategies to think about.
I wanted to address two other things. There's one question about the legal consequences for parents who don't comply with drug court orders. in most states, I think there are no consequences because the court has jurisdiction over the youth, but not the parents. There may be a few states where that's an exception, but not in my state. I don't think we have, you have powers of persuasion, but you don't have any legal authority over the parents. If anybody has different experiences with that, I'd be interested in knowing. The other issue is, I think a lot of what we've talked about goes to building trust with the child. And, it really starts the first time they appear in court, and it's a little bit of giving agency one step at a time and not letting go. And what I'm thinking of when I say that is, there were occasions when I was on the bench where I would send youth to a residential program for kids with co-occurring disorders. It was a wonderful program. I did not suspend the court hearings while they were there. They called in with their counselor. And what I found after trying that was they really wanted to talk about their successes. And we need to take advantage of every little bit of success they feel, because that is how you decrease, at least in my view, the shame and stigma. They're with others who have been through the same thing. They're making progress. They're getting to know themselves. They're trying to figure out what comes next. And they're feeling successful, and you have to help them celebrate those successes. I think that's a really important part of diminishing shame. Lauren, I don't know quite what our timeline is, but I'm guessing, since we've been talking for a long time, we may be close to the end.
Yeah, we are. Are there any final points that either one of you would like to leave us on?
Well, I don't know if it's exactly where I'd want to leave us, but I did want to loop back to something about the youth generation now definitely does have less stigma around mental health. Like, someone kind of chimed in agreement with that. I'm not sure I have lots of nice things to say about TikTok, but I actually do attribute TikTok and sort of social media culture. There's been a deep thread in TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram to a certain degree of kind of mental health awareness and destigmatizing. Not the only places but I think that's the place where a lot of youth are really getting that normalized. I will say, for folks who follow the news, there have already been some sort of unintended consequences to that. So I don't want to be like, oh, it's great, because there's a little bit of weirdness that's happening too, where youth are sort of deciding that they have particular mental health symptoms where they didn't previously have them. So as with all social media and young people and the brains of young people, I think we should be very cautious. But yeah, I definitely think that the stigma is down on mental health. But to Judge Mack's earlier point, the question of, do you want a mental health assessment and do you want to talk to a therapist, is probably not as good of a framing as, would you just like to talk to somebody? Would you like to check in? And I really loved the bit about, like, kind of leveraging the idea of what's more courageous. I think that's good.